Well, at the time of this recording, we're in the second half of 2024, and at this point, you've probably heard of the likes of OpenAI's ChatGPT, Google Gemini, and other generative AI tools. But what are they exactly, and how might you use them as a data analyst? I'm going to address all of that and more in this video. Stay tuned. Let's start this lesson by using ChatGPT as an example. ChatGPT is a generative artificial intelligence program that understands human language through prompts and responds to you with an answer. That might not sound like much, but the possibilities for what you can do with programs like ChatGPT are endless, especially when it comes to data analytics. So, for example, here's what happens when I ask ChatGPT to visually explain to me what SQL is and why it's important for data analysts. As you can see, it generates a response as if I were talking to an actual human. Here's another example. Here I'm asking ChatGPT to generate a table of patient information in SQL, and then I'm asking it to give me some code that will sort the Medicare patients by their last name in alphabetical order. There are an endless array of prompts that you can type into ChatGPT, and it will generate an endless array of results. It can generate programming code for you in almost any language like SQL, Python, and R. It can troubleshoot your code. It can generate data for you. It can detect patterns and analyze your data. It can wordsmith things for you. It can help you with the creative thinking process. It can educate you about different concepts. It can even process files like Excel, CSV, PDF, and it can also be used for free. So that's pretty crazy, but how is it even able to do this in the first place? Well, to answer that, let's take a look at a high level at what ChatGPT is doing. The GPT in ChatGPT is a technology developed by a company called OpenAI. Their GPT technology stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. Generative simply means it is capable of generating some text. Pre-trained means that there is a massive amount of data in the form of text that the GPT technology relies upon to keep it educated in its responses. It sources that data from books, websites, news articles, research papers, coding repositories, social media posts, and so on. Lastly, the T stands for transformer. This is where a lot of the action takes place. Transformers are very complicated, and they involve a lot of understanding about linear algebra and matrices and some complicated computer science concepts. And to be honest, it really makes my brain hurt just trying to think about all of the stuff that goes on in the background. So I'm going to explain it at a very high level. First, consider this prompt that I give ChatGPT. A patient walks into a hospital emergency room. If this person is patient enough to not leave prematurely, how long will they spend on average before they are discharged? So this is a kind of wordy example, but what I'm doing here is I'm asking ChatGPT to tell me how long it typically takes patients to complete their treatment in the emergency room. Notice how I included the word patient twice. The first use of the word is used in the context of a person who is a patient in a hospital. The second use is in the context of a person exercising the virtue of patience, someone who is willing to wait long periods of time without complaint. ChatGPT understands that although the word is the same, it carries different meanings throughout the prompt. It does this by first breaking down each word of the prompt into something called a token. These tokens are given numerical values that represent different things about that word that it learned from its training data. Things like how close the word patient tends to be to other words in a bunch of other sentences. In previous sentences that it trained on, maybe the word patient tends to be clustered closely to other words like hospital, ER, doctor, or medicine. Now, another thing that it's doing in the background is it's taking note of all the words in the prompt and how each word relates to the other words. So, for example, the first use of the word patient is closer to the words hospital and emergency than the second use of the word patient, suggesting that it is a sort of noun in a healthcare context. while the second use of the word patient is closer to a word like enough, suggesting that the second use of the word patient is functioning more like an adjective or a describing word, as in, this person is patient enough not to complain even though they are in extreme pain because of their collapsed lung and they've been waiting in the ER for 12 hours to speak with a doctor. You get the idea. ChatGPT keeps track of things like this using a list of numerical values that are tracked for each token. And eventually ChatGPT takes all these values and creates a list of final words that all have different probability values that determine how likely a given word should be featured as the next one in the response. It takes the word with the highest probability value, adds it to the sentence, then repeats this process iteratively, factoring in the new word it just added. It keeps doing this until all the words in the sentence have been generated. That's the basic idea of a transformer. Now, collectively, the GPT in ChatGPT is what is known as a large language model, or LLM, and there are different versions of GPT. As of this recording, GPT-4 is the most up-to-date model. ChatGPT itself isn't an LLM. It utilizes an LLM called GPT. The chat in ChatGPT is simply a user interface that I'm showing you now that cleanly takes your prompt and feeds it into the GPT LLM, and then it returns a response. ChatGPT streamlines this whole process for you and alleviates the need to have a technical background to use it. However, if you did have the technical background, you could ignore the chat part of ChatGPT and just hook up to the GPT directly with programming languages like Python using something called an API. Why might you want to do this? Well, when you use ChatGPT for free, there is a limit to the amount of prompts that you can use. Whereas when you access GPT, you are generally paying in credits. In exchange, you are getting a proportional amount of work out of GPT, which means you get to bypass those limits provided you have the money. So as an example of leveraging the GPT technology, I could ask GPT to intake 40 Excel spreadsheets and consolidate them into a single spreadsheet. And as long as you have the credits, you could set up a process from Python that accesses the GPT technology to do this for you. And you could automate it so it does this on a regular basis. That said, whether it's ChatGPT or just GPT or Gemini or any other LLM for that matter, I always avoid using them to process data unless I am completely sure that that data is not private or confidential. And we'll explore why later. But the point is, by accessing GPT directly, you have access to more scalable options and can do so much more with it. Now at this point, I'm going to take a short break and tell you about my free 1-hour Pivot into Clinical Analytics webinar. If you want to become a clinical data analyst but don't know where to start, I break down all of the things you need to know to go from zero to hero in the span of 10 weeks, all for free. This includes a SQL curriculum, a Tableau curriculum, and how to acquire healthcare knowledge for free. Last but not least, I show you how to fast track your job application process by networking. Networking is one of the most important things you can do for your career to land a job as a data analyst. And it's actually not too difficult to do, especially with websites like LinkedIn. So in this webinar, I show you some of my favorite networking secrets to accelerate your job search. The webinar is offered twice daily, and if you miss it, that's okay because I'll send you the recording later. So if you're interested in signing up, you can go to datawizardry.academy, click on resources, and then click on Pivot into Clinical Analytics webinar. Or you can click the link here in the video or in the description below to sign up. Now let's get back to the lesson. So we've talked a lot about the nuts and bolts of generative AI like ChatGPT. As you can imagine, as a data analyst, I use ChatGPT mainly for generating code, particularly for SQL, Excel formulas, and Python. So here's a SQL example. I need to use a SQL function that helps me determine the age of a patient during the hospital visit based off of their birth date and the time they are admitted to the hospital. The dialect I am using is PostgreSQL. Notice how specific I am being with my prompt. When I use ChatGPT, I like to use as much context as possible so that the answer that is generated is as helpful as possible. I tell it the type of result I want based off of the data that I have, as well as the dialect of SQL that I am using. I could have easily substituted PostgreSQL with a different dialect, such as SQL Server or Snowflake. I could also ask ChatGPT to conjure up some Python code for me. Let's say I wanted it to give me some starter code to forecast some values based off of some historical data. ChatGPT can do this too, and it does it in seconds. Now, sometimes it will give me a result that doesn't work. So when that happens, you can tell ChatGPT this result doesn't work. You can tell it the error message that you received. Sometimes it will correct itself and give you a better answer. And sometimes it will lead you down a rabbit hole where it will give you one incorrect answer after another. This is an example of an LLM hallucination. In other words, sometimes ChatGPT makes stuff up. After all, at its core, it's simply generating a sentence based off of the laws of probability and the prompt that you wrote. It's not always guaranteed to produce an accurate answer, and sometimes that training text it uses is out of date for certain concepts. We'll talk about the implications of this a little bit later. My second favorite use for ChatGPT is troubleshooting code. Suppose I wrote a SQL query like this, and I just can't figure out why it isn't running properly. I could spend a few minutes looking at it, I could even spend hours on it, and then I might be able to determine that I'm missing a comma, that I forgot the on phrasing of the join, that I didn't write my common table expression correctly, or I could just plug this into ChatGPT and have it give me an answer instantly. Now, again, since LLMs can make stuff up or hallucinate, you may find that ChatGPT leads you down the wrong path. If it does, I give it a couple more chances to give me a correct answer by telling it that its answer didn't work, as well as providing the error message. If that doesn't work, I usually give up and consult other sources like Stack Overflow. Another great use for ChatGPT is administrative tasks. Let's say you're about to send an email to your customers or stakeholders for a project that you're working on, and you need to explain something technical to them in a way that makes sense, and you need to send it through email. ChatGPT can take an email you are about to send and wordsmith it in a way that makes it really easy to understand. For example, let's say I'm about to send this message that explains how I'm going to pull some data from one of our business intelligence tools. I could write a prompt into ChatGPT that goes as follows. Wordsmith this email as if I were explaining this to a senior manager with 20 years of experience in healthcare that does not necessarily understand the intricacies of data migration processes, databases, or SQL. Make the email informative but concise. Here is the result that ChatGPT gives me. Again, providing more context can be helpful here as ChatGPT will give you a more targeted result for your specific situation. Now keep in mind that so far, I've just been using ChatGPT as an example. Everything I talk about here is applicable to other generative AI tools out there. ChatGPT is just one type of generative AI program. Gemini, formerly known as Bard, is a Google product that uses an LLM different than OpenAI's GPT. And similarly, Llama is the generative AI that Meta has developed using their own LLM. And as you can imagine, there are several popular LLMs out there in the wild, and I'm sure that number is bound to grow as this technology evolves. But as I explained earlier, LLM is not without its flaws. Since LLMs are simply using probability to generate sentences in relation to a prompt, this actually introduces some potential problems. And because of those potential problems, there are some things that I never use ChatGPT for. We've already seen how LLMs can hallucinate or make stuff up. For this reason, I try to avoid prompts in ChatGPT where I can't verify the answer for myself directly. For example, I'm a data analyst in the healthcare space, and at a prior hospital, I was tasked with building a report that tracked Medicare patients for which we performed total hip and knee replacement surgeries. In that report, we needed to include a column in our dataset that tracked whether or not patients were given narcotics for any period 90 days prior to surgery. So in theory, I could have asked ChatGPT to list out all the narcotic drugs that are commonly used nowadays for pain treatment. And suppose it lists certain drugs like oxycodone, methadone, codeine, and so forth. But it's not that simple. How do I know that that list that ChatGPT just gave me is accurate and complete? After all, we know that it can hallucinate. How would I verify this as correct? On my own, I really shouldn't because I haven't been to medical school or nursing school. And it's for this reason that I avoid asking ChatGPT knowledge-based questions without being able to easily verify or cross-check that information for myself. So for something like this, I would sooner trust a human medical expert like a doctor or a pharmacist for that information. There's another danger to using ChatGPT for something like this though, and that's bias. So returning to our example, when I asked ChatGPT to list out all the narcotic drugs it knows about, maybe I'm assuming that all these drugs are to be given orally or by mouth. But little do I know that this is not necessarily the case. In reality, these drugs could potentially also be given intranasally, intravenously, intramuscularly, subcutaneously, among other routes. I could be undercounting the patients that were dependent on narcotics if I were only looking at those that received their medication orally through pill form. If I wasn't aware of this important omission and just asked ChatGPT to give me a list, I have committed ChatGPT's results to bias. It's simply carrying out my instructions without necessarily knowing about the dangers of my omission. And this is just one of many examples of bias. ChatGPT is certainly capable of giving me flawed information if I give it a flawed prompt, or if its training data is flawed in and of itself. Let's consider a more dangerous example. Suppose I gave ChatGPT a bunch of data and I wanted it to determine which types of patients are more likely to die based off of potential adverse drug reactions, and I also asked it to provide specific recommendations. Suppose it analyzed the data and said that type A patients are most likely to die from drug reactions, and therefore extra care should be given to those patients to ensure that these adverse reactions do not occur. Now consider that type A could be anything. It could be a given race, ethnicity, gender, age, social status. It could be anything really. So hypothetically, if ChatGPT recommended that we give extra care to a certain race at the potential neglect or expense of others, well, we are now treading in very dangerous territory because we have obtained a biased and potentially racist result. And if we act upon its recommendations without being aware of that bias, it could lead to disparities in care. So just keep in mind that ChatGPT is only as good as the data and the prompts that we give it. Sometimes our prompts are flawed, and sometimes the data it is trained on is flawed because we as humans are flawed. Remember, ChatGPT is going through training data on news articles, Wikipedia articles, everything that is generated by humans, and humans are inherently flawed, and therefore there will always be some degree of bias to be on the lookout for. Another major issue is how ChatGPT handles sensitive and proprietary data. In the previous example, I explored the possibility of bias when giving ChatGPT a bunch of data to analyze. Now, normally, I wouldn't give ChatGPT data to analyze because I work in the healthcare space, and in the United States, we have laws like HIPAA, which enforce complete protection of a patient's medical records. So if that data were to end up in the wrong hands, hospitals and providers can get sued for thousands and sometimes even millions of dollars. For example, in 2023, Yakima Valley Hospital in Washington State was responsible for $240,000 because several security guards illegally accessed 419 patient records. When you add up the many cases through the years like these, the US government has collected over $140 million of penalties in HIPAA violations as of May 2024. So this is a very big deal, and it makes you think, can I really trust LLMs with private and sensitive data? They may promise not to do anything with the data, but I'm not going to take that risk. And personally, I can tell you that I have worked at 2 hospitals now that have specifically forbidden inputting sensitive data into platforms like ChatGPT. Some hospitals are even creating policies that ask employees to leave meetings when an AI note taker is involved in that meeting. Long story short, Be very careful about what you put into ChatGPT because you never know what they might do with that data once you hit that enter button. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of what generative AI is and how it can be used responsibly. One final question that was asked a lot during the initial craze of LLMs was, is this going to take our jobs? My personal opinion is that while content writers like journalists and creative writers might be at risk of losing jobs due to generative AI, I don't really see this happening for data analysts. Why? Well, to understand why, I'm going to recommend that you check out this next video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another video.